Edie Sedgwick, fashion icon, model, it girl, Warhol superstar, youth Quaker, was part of a very prominent American aristocracy kind of family. The Sedgwicks actually originated in England, but they came to America pretty much at the beginning of America. Robert Sedgwick came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1636 as part of the Great Migration. And from there, his descendants were incredibly prominent in business, in law, in politics, in fashion, in the arts. There are still prominent Sedgwicks with us to this very day. But the Sedgwicks really thought quite highly of themselves, and in fact, they thought so highly of themselves that there is a very famous grave plot in Massachusetts called the Sedgwick Pie. At the center of this grave plot is the grave of Theodore Sedgwick, who was born in 1746 and is widely considered to be the patriarch of the Sedgwick family. His grave sits at the center, and then in concentric circles, with their heads facing away and their feet facing towards Theodore, is his descendants, his in-laws, servants, and pets. And these graves of all of these people form concentric circles going out and out and out away from the center. And the legend has it that when Judgment Day comes and all these people rise from the dead, they will rise up facing only other Sedgwicks as far as the eye can see. Because no one else is worth it, apparently. So, hi, I'm Kate Name, and I am the writer, creator, producer of a show called The Factory, which is an immersive show about Andy Warhol's factory and the events that led to his attempted assassination by Valerie Solanas. It is a super fun show, you guys. It's basically you as the audience are invited to a party at the factory where you can sit for your own screen tests, you can help silk screen paintings, you can help film an underground movie, you can rock out with the band. There's endless ways to participate in the show. You can follow Valerie, join Scum, go to a Scum meeting, see why she shot Andy Warhol, or you can ignore all that, try and get in with Andy and try and be Andy Warhol's next superstar, like Edie Sedgwick. So it's very choose your own adventure. It's very fun. The show itself is an hour, but the show loops. So each performance is 2 hours in total, meaning you have the chance to see the show from two different perspectives, and you can follow whatever you want and do literally whatever you want. I mean, within reason, but like there's no restrictions. You can follow whoever, do whatever. If you want to spend the whole show just painting, you can do that. But I am an independent producer. I have been working on this show since 2015, and I am finally at the point where we're getting close to being able to do it. I'm planning a production in 2025 at $3 Bill in Brooklyn, and I kind of need your help. This is my project as a solo person. I have other people involved at this point, but primarily it's me doing this, and it costs money to produce immersive theater. And so if you would like to help, the link will be in my bio. You can donate to the show. The show is fiscally sponsored by Fractured Atlas, a nonprofit arts organization, so all donations are tax deductible. And if you want to help in another way, whether that's an idea you have or something that we could talk about together, please send me an email. My email will be in my bio. I would love to hear from you. Truly, like if you think this is cool in any way, shape, or form, send me an email and we can talk, because it's just me out here and I'm working pretty hard. So with all that being said, let's talk about Edie Sedgwick. I did do a little Edie eye look today. I am not a makeup artist, but I tried, so let me know what you think about that. I did my earrings too. Okay, so anyways, hi, Edie Sedgwick. I actually felt I felt some feelings about making this video because, at this point, I have spent so much time with each of the characters in the show. There's 12 characters in the show. They're all based on real people at the factory, and I feel like very connected at this point, 10 years in almost. I feel very connected to all of them. I feel like I know them intimately. That is not true. I am slightly delusional. That's not true. I am somewhat delusional, but they mean quite a lot to me. And Edie in particular is such a tragic story that I just, even though I know this is just a dumb YouTube video that no one's gonna watch, but I feel so strongly about her that I just want to do her justice. And there's no way that I'm going to be able to cover each and every detail about her in this little video. So I just want to like give a heads up that I am going to be doing a brief general outline of her life. But I love her so much, and her story is really sad and touching, and I just feel a lot of feelings about it. So I just wanted to say that up front. I don't even know, it's not a trigger warning, it's just a Edie is sad. Edie makes me sad. I love Edie. Okay, let's start. So, Edie Sedgwick was born April 20th, 1943. She was the seventh and youngest child of Alice and Fuzzy Sedgwick. His name is Francis, her father, but he went by Fuzzy. And he was, to put it mildly, incredibly narcissistic, incredibly abusive, very controlling. And although the family was kind of like this aristocracy from New England kind of family, Alice and Fuzzy moved to California before Edie's birth, and they lived on this super sprawling, very isolated ranch. So Edie grew up pretty much only with her family. She did not have a lot of like outside contact with anybody else. And because the Sedgwicks were the Sedgwicks and they thought quite highly of themselves, she was pretty much raised to believe that she was superior to everybody else. Not just her, but her family. The Sedgwick family was superior to everyone. And she lived like this kind of, in some ways, idyllic childhood where she lived in her imagination. The kids were homeschooled. They really just very, very isolated. And she had a very vivid imagination, and she was able to entertain herself, and she was the baby of the family, and everyone loved her. Okay, that being said, the family was dark. There's no real other way to say that. Her father was abusive to all of them, but I think Edie suffered, you know, this kind of thing with youngest children. As the older siblings grow up and go away, you're used to this big family, and then one by one her siblings leave and she becomes more and more and more isolated as the youngest. And so that's one element of it. The other element of it that I just have to come out and say is that her father was abusive towards her, and she claims that the way she phrased it was that her father first made a pass at her when she was around 9 years old. Other reports say as young as 7. It's not exactly clear when it started, but what we do know is that it definitely was happening. So that starts super young. She develops an eating disorder also pretty young, probably in reaction to this abuse that she was suffering. But guess what? It gets worse. In her early teens, probably, I'm not exactly sure the year on this, I don't know if this is reported anywhere, but her father, Fuzzy, who was always having affairs with all sorts of women, young Edie walks in one day on Fuzzy sleeping with one of his mistresses, and she is totally shocked. Her father, in response to Edie walking in, slaps her across the face, just tells her that she's imagining things, that what she's seeing is not real, that she's going crazy. And then they call a doctor over that night to tranquilize her. So that's traumatic. That's super traumatic. And so that's just to paint a picture of what life was like in the Sedgwick world. Extremely dysfunctional, extremely abusive, but also with this air of like, we're so wealthy and we're better than everyone. So that's what she's starting with. In 1958, at 15 years old, Edie enrolls at an all-girls boarding school called St. Timothy's in Maryland. And at first, Edie is like super, super popular. She can be very charming, she's very charismatic, and she entertains all the girls at St. Timothy's with these glamorous stories of Sedgwick family life. And Edie and pretty much everyone else in her family, they were very good looking. Beautiful people. Even her parents, beautiful people. And so to outsiders, these young girls at St. Timothy's, the Sedgwick family is like celebrities basically. And Edie regales them with like charming stories of dinners and adventures and all of the fabulous people that come to see them, and horseback riding and sculptures and all these wonderful things that they do on the Sedgwick family ranch. And she becomes like the most popular girl at St. Timothy's for a little while. But by Christmas, oh, she's elected class president, by the way. By Christmas, her popularity has escalated into like warring cliques, two separate factions that are fighting each other. And she is very adept at turning girls against each other and provoking them and just kind of stirring the pot. She courts power, she encourages rivalries, and she demands public displays of like adoration. By the spring, this has all fallen apart, and she begins like losing control of her emotions. She like explodes in public. She has meltdowns. She attacks teachers. She attacks students, and she obsessively is like picking at her skin and her face and her nails, and her eating disorder also starts to get really bad, and she does not return to St. Timothy's the following year. So in 1962, Edie is displaying increasingly manic behavior, and her eating disorder, which is undiagnosed at the time, is spiraling out of control. And so she's placed in a psychiatric hospital called Silver Hills in Connecticut. And she spends a fair amount of time there, ends up leaving somewhat recovered, and she enrolls in Cambridge University. And then 2 years later, in 1964, March of 1964, Edie's closest brother, Minty, is also admitted into Silver Hills Psychiatric Hospital for similar problems, and he himself at Silver Hill. And Edie is devastated. This is her closest brother, but just a few weeks after that, she turns 21, and she comes into a trust that is set up by her grandmother that now dispenses $10,000 into her account every month. And suddenly, with access to all these funds, and again, this is the 60s, so $10,000 was quite a bit more money than it is now. It's still a lot of money now. She decides she's bored of Cambridge and she doesn't want to go to school anymore, and she's going to go to New York City. And pretty much immediately, Edie Sedgwick meets Bob Dylan and his friend Bobby Newirth at Kettle of Fish, which was a beat poet hangout in Greenwich Village. And Dylan is enchanted with Edie Sedgwick. He actually, here's what my bias is going to come out now. I do not like Bob Dylan. And he like later on kind of claimed that he didn't really know Edie and they were never romantic and like they're barely acquaintances, but they were very close. They were romantically involved, in my opinion. And that started in 1964. So Edie's loving New York. She is having a great time, and she goes back home for Christmas in 1964. And on December 31st, Edie, who is visiting her parents for the holidays, goes for a New Year's Eve joyride in her father's Porsche. And Edie runs a red light, and the car is sideswiped and slammed into a light pole. And Edie's passenger, who is a childhood friend, requires 22 stitches. Edie actually walked away with very minor injuries, and the next day, a photo of the crash was in the newspapers with the caption, "How did two people step out of this car alive?" Now, the weird part about this is on that same night, December 31st, 1964, Edie's brother, Bobby Sedgwick, goes for a New Year's Eve joyride on his motorcycle. And he is speeding through Manhattan on his Harley Davidson, and he races up 8th Avenue. He's not wearing a helmet, and at nearly the same moment that Edie crashed her car in California, Bobby crashes his motorcycle into the side of a bus and is killed. So now, this is the second brother that Edie has lost in kind of a dramatic, traumatic way. And there is some speculation that this was an intentional act on Bobby's part. There is no way to really know, but suffice to say, all of the Sedgwick children quite troubled, probably because of their insane father. So Edie comes back to New York after this whole incident, and she still kind of brushes everything off and is living her life and being kind of a party girl. And in 1965, she meets Andy Warhol at a party, a birthday party for Tennessee Williams. Wild. And I have not touched on Andy much in this video, but at this point, Andy Warhol's factory was in full swing. And I'm not gonna dive into too much of like that whole scene. You can watch some of my other videos if you're curious about the factory, but to put it briefly, Andy Warhol's factory was basically this 24-hour, anybody's invited, spaced out, covered in silver art studio. It was at this former hat factory in Midtown Manhattan, this big industrial space, and there was always like cool people, models, celebrities, drag queens, criminals, artists, literally from all walks of life. People were showing up at the factory because word had spread around New York City that this Andy Warhol guy could make you famous. Andy Warhol was doing this series called The 13 Most Beautiful Girls and the 13 Most Beautiful Boys. And it was a series of screen tests that he used to kind of flatter anybody that came to the factory. So someone would show up at the factory and Andy would be like, oh my God, you're so beautiful. You should be one of my most 13 beautiful girls. And of course, there were way more than just 13 beautiful boys and 13 beautiful girls, but it was his way of it kind of christening superstars. And Superstars in 1965 was Andy's new project, just making stars. So Andy Warhol, always on the lookout for new superstars, sees Edie Sedgwick at this birthday party for Tennessee Williams and is instantly enamored. He is so charmed by Edie. And Edie has no idea who he is, literally none. But she's flattered by his attention and they become friends, and Andy invites Edie to start hanging out at the factory. And so she does, and then almost immediately she cuts her hair and dyes it silver. Kind of, a lot of people think that she's trying to mimic Andy Warhol. She says she just likes the idea of having light hair and dark eyes. Speaking of haircuts, the person who gave Edie this haircut was none other than Billy Name, and they did it on the fire escape of the factory. If you watch my Billy Name video, you would know that this whole factory actually kind of came about because Billy Name was giving people haircuts. He was, this is a quick side note, but I love this story. Billy had done this whole silver thing to his own apartment. He was on meth, on speed, all the time, covered his apartment in tinfoil, and he knew how to cut hair. And so he was having these hair cutting parties at his apartment where he was like, yeah, just come over, everybody can come and we can all do speed and I'll give everyone a haircut. And so Andy Warhol had gone to one of these hair cutting parties at Billy's apartment and seen the whole shimmering scene of beautiful people taking drugs and getting their hair cut, and was like, oh my God, this has to be a movie. And so he invited Billy to come do this whole silver thing in his new space, the factory that he had just signed a lease on. And then the first film that they filmed was this short film called Haircut, where Billy is giving haircuts to people. Freddie Herco is one of those people. So, quick side note, haircuts, very important to the factory. So Andy has been shooting these underground films and he's working on this film called Vinyl. And Gerard Malanga, Andy's assistant, very hunky guy, was told that he was going to be the star of Vinyl. And Andy's like, oh, Edie won't even talk. We'll just put her on this little bench or something. She's just gonna sit there, she's gonna smoke a cigarette, but Gerard, you are still the star of the show. And so they film Vinyl, and Gerard does have the lines, but Edie is the breakout star. She just is so gorgeous, sitting there smoking her cigarette, that everyone who sees it is like, who is that girl? And so Edie becomes what Andy dubs Girl of the Year. And Girl of the Year is kind of like similar thing to the Superstars. It's the idea that stardom is disposable and that the rise of a star is just as important to the fall of the star. And in fact, the fall is kind of what makes somebody a star. So the idea that like this year is this girl and next year will be a new girl and we'll throw that old girl away and get a new one, like that is kind of part of the whole ethos behind the Superstars. So Edie is named Girl of the Year. So this really all comes to a head in April of 1965 when film producer Lester Persky, I can't talk today, throws a party at the factory. It's kind of like co-thrown by Lester and Andy Warhol, and it's called the 50 Most Beautiful People Party. And they invite a bunch of celebrities and also kind of factory regulars. And it's the first like big event that the factory throws. And it's honestly so cute. The party is really intended to be a crossover event where celebrities can mingle with the avant-garde, druggy, like, you know, downtown community. And Billy Name, who was very nervous about serving alcohol at the factory, which is crazy because they were all doing drugs all the time, but alcohol, you know, very fancy. So Billy sets up this table of cocktails, and the first person to arrive at the 50 Most Beautiful People party is Judy Garland. And the industrial elevator doors open, and Judy Garland is cradled in the arms of Lester Persky, this film producer, and Tennessee Williams, and they bring her in for this grand entrance, and nobody is there. Billy Name is just standing there like setting up the cocktails as Judy Garland is carried in for her grand entrance. And then she's very embarrassed because nobody was there to see it, and so they kind of quickly put her down and act like it didn't happen. But that is kind of like, it's this sea change that happens almost instantaneously, because even though Judy Garland is like Judy Garland, and especially at the time, you know, she's this huge star, as the party goes on, it becomes clear that all eyes are on Edie Sedgwick and that there's a new kind of star. Because now we would call Edie like an influencer, but that term did not exist, and social media did not exist, and there was no way to become famous back then except through traditional media, you know, movies, radio, television, writing. You had to do something to become famous back then. You couldn't just become famous. But Andy Warhol kind of created that idea that maybe you could just become famous. And that was Edie. Edie was the embodiment of this new kind of star where you're just famous for being famous. And it really threw Judy Garland off. I don't think she had a great time at this party. I mean, like, all accounts, she had a good time, but it was very apparent to everyone in the room that like the old celebrities were not cool anymore. It was these new superstars that really were it. Later that summer, in 1965, Andy films a series of films starring Edie Sedgwick and kind of like Edie as herself living her life. And they are Restaurant, Poor Little Rich Girl, Afternoon, and Beauty Number 2. And they're kind of meant to be a day in the life of a star. So Poor Little Rich Girl is Edie in the morning, Afternoon is her kind of at lunch, and then Beauty Number 2 depicts her later in the day, and Restaurant presents her at dinner. So she's really becoming something in the underground scene, so much so that in July 1965, Vogue does an article about Edie Sedgwick, and they feature her in her signature look of her black tights and her leotards and her long dangly earrings, and they call her a youth Quaker. And she's kind of the embodiment of like the fresh young things that are shaking up New York City, and she becomes an instant celebrity after this. This is really when she becomes like, she is known. And it's, again, not because of anything that she's accomplished. It's really just based on her image alone. So in fall of 1965, Andy Warhol has his first retrospective at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. And he brings Edie Sedgwick and this art curator named Henry Geldzaler. Geldzaler? I think that's how you say it. I'm sorry, Henry, I love you. I know a lot about you, but I can't say your last name. I'm bad at talking. But yes, Henry and Edie accompany Andy to this opening of his first retrospective, and they are absolutely mobbed. There are so many people that come to see Edie and Andy that they have to actually take the art off the walls so that it won't get damaged. So no one's even there to see the art, it's gone, but they're all there to see Andy and especially Edie. And they end up having to like climb on like a ladder, I think like a fire escape, and they end up like above the crowd. And Edie's wearing these silvery sleeves that like are way longer than her hands, and she's like teasing the crowd with her sleeves, and somebody ends up like passing a microphone to her, and she like just talks and kind of vamps in front of this huge crowd, literally thousands of people at an art exhibit. And she talks, her and Henry and Andy are just stuck pretty much on the roof, and she talks to the crowd for over 2 hours, and eventually the police have to come and they all go onto the roof, and they're able to escape the mob on the roof with the help of the police. So she is it. She is very, very famous. well, relatively speaking. By late January of 1966, Edie becomes suspicious that Andy is not taking her seriously, and he's also not paying her for her work. Andy Warhol actually was not paying anyone for their work. The only person in the whole factory story from 1962 to 1968, the only person that got paid was Gerard Malanga, who I mentioned earlier. Because Gerard was Andy's assistant, he knew how to silk screen. So he was kind of like the silk screen guy. He made minimum wage. Nobody else got paid. So Edie thinks that Andy's taking advantage of her, which he was, and she also kind of becomes suspicious that he's mocking her and like not taking her seriously as a person. And Bob Dylan is also kind of in her ear at this point saying that, she could really be a real movie star, not like this weirdo art underground movies. Like she could go to Hollywood and actually for real be a movie star. And so she ends up having this big fight with Andy and leaving the factory. And she stays in New York, but her and Andy, their relationship is kind of sad. So Edie moves into the Chelsea Hotel and she becomes very close with Bob Dylan. And actually, Dylan convinces Edie to sign with his manager, this guy named Albert Grossman. And Edie is convinced and kind of convinced by Bob Dylan that she should go to Hollywood and become like a real Hollywood star. And Dylan also apparently tells Edie that he will star in a movie with her. And Edie thinks this is going to be her ticket to stardom. Now, Dylan, not a very truthful guy. And Edie was very infatuated with Bob Dylan. She definitely had a crush on him. And she thought that Bob Dylan had a crush on her too. In fact, Bob Dylan has written songs that are widely speculated to be about Edie, Leopard Skin, Pillbox Hat being one of them, and also about just like the factory itself. He was pretty, he did not like Andy Warhol and he did not like the factory, and he made that very clear. But Edie was infatuated with Bob Dylan, and during this time, Bob Dylan secretly marries his girlfriend, this woman named Sarah Lowndes, in November of 1965. And some sources say that Edie found out about this marriage by reading it in the newspaper. Other sources claim that she found out from Warhol himself. Not entirely sure how she found out, but when she found out, she was devastated. And Bob Dylan I hate Bob Dylan, honestly. But suffice to say, Bob Dylan probably never really had any plans to star in a film with Edie Sedgwick. That was just what he was telling her. She spends a couple more years in New York and she continues to spiral out of control. She's still doing a lot of drugs and partying and just blowing through her money. She is spending all of her money, and her eating disorder is also getting pretty bad. And she would go to restaurants and order just like plates and plates and plates of really fancy food, kind of binging and purging, and then go to the bathroom and get rid of it. So she's having a bad time. And then in May of 1967, Edie is living at the Hotel Chelsea and she sets her hotel room on fire. And the whole room goes up in smoke. She fell asleep with candles burning and she's awakened by smoke and flames. She tries to open the door, but the handle is scorching hot and she can't open it. And eventually she's able to yank the door open and she collapses fully nude in the hall. And Edie's bed actually burns through the floor and like falls to the apartment below. And her cat, named Smoke, very sad, ends up dying in the fire as well. None of her belongings are salvageable. Like literally the whole room is just completely destroyed. It's a wonder that the whole building wasn't destroyed, honestly. So after the hotel fire, she returns to the Warhol scene to film this movie, Ciao Manhattan. And Ciao Manhattan was an interesting project because it was financed by Warhol. He threw over $47,000 at this project, but it was actually created by these guys that were kind of factory people. They were like hangers-on of the factory. And it's a semi-autobiographical film starring Edie Sedgwick kind of playing herself, and it's co-directed by John Palmer and David Wiseman. And this film production, it is bloated, it drags on and on and on. No one knows what this movie is even about because in kind of Warhol style, they just turn the cameras on and see what happens. And it's very chaotic, it's like over budget, it continues to be over budget, and it never really gets finished. And Edie is, at the same time as she's filming this movie, starting to spiral more and more out of control. And so the film ends up not getting finished after the summer is over, and Edie is hospitalized again at the end of the summer, and she has she goes back to her family in California. She's hospitalized there. She eventually is released under the supervision of a psychiatrist, 2 nurses, and the live-in care of filmmaker John Palmer, who was one of the guys who was doing Chow Manhattan. And because she's kind of estranged from her family, it's a whole mess. And so she's determined to try and finish Chow Manhattan. So in California, John Palmer and some other people that were involved in like the Manhattan version of Chow Manhattan come to California, and they finish filming Chow Manhattan, and it ends up becoming this film kind of about, it's about Edie really. They kind of, I think they call her Susan Superstar in the film, but it's essentially the Edie Sedgwick story, and it is incredibly hard to watch, in my opinion. It's made at the end of her life. She is clearly very out of it. I mean, it's a cult classic at this point, and it's one of Edie Sedgwick's most known films because you actually can like rent it and watch it. And a lot of her Warhol films are like kind of hard to come by. And this also is a film that has something of a plot. It's not a super strong plot, but it's more of a plot than the Warhol films. So it is probably her most well-known film, but I have seen it. I find it hard to watch. It just makes me very sad. But if you want to check it out, you know, you can. So that is her last appearance on film. She does try and make it in Hollywood after that, but she's not cast in anything really relevant, and she just is continuing to struggle. And she goes back into the hospital again, and she meets this other patient at the psychiatric hospital named Michael Post. And when they both come out of the hospital, they get married. And Edie continues to struggle. She had achieved sobriety during this period, but she relapsed in 1971 after taking prescription pain medication given to her for a physical illness. And then that in turn leads her to abusing drugs again and also getting back into alcohol. And on the night of November 15th, 1971, Edie goes to a fashion show at the Santa Barbara Museum that includes a segment filmed for television, the television show An American Family. And she drinks alcohol and she has a great time, and she goes home. She phones her husband. Michael Post comes and picks her up. They go home, and before they fall asleep, Michael Post gives Edie her medication, and she falls asleep. And Michael notices that her breathing is like very, very heavy and sounds bad, but he kind of just assumes that that's just Edie, and he falls asleep. And that night, November 15th, 1971, Edie passes away in her sleep. And she, you know, word spreads to all of the factory people. Andy Warhol is very callous about it. He doesn't comment on her death. He does not attend her funeral. That will be a habit of his going forward, because sadly, quite a lot of factory people died tragically young. But yeah, Andy does not acknowledge her death, and life at the factory moves on. And Edie, actually, to kind of wrap things up in a full circle way, Edie is not buried at the Sedgwick Pie. She is buried in California. And on her gravestone, her epitaph reads, Edith Sedgwick Post, wife of Michael Brett Post, 1943 to 1971. She was 28 years old when she passed away. So I'm gonna leave it there today because I just don't have that much more to say about Edie. I mean, I feel like I could have waxed poetic about Edie and what she means forever, but I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you so much for watching. I've really been enjoying making these videos. If you made it to the end of the video, please give this video a like. It really helps the channel out. Subscribe if you want more of this content. I will be making new videos every week about factory people and other stories and influences on my show. So I am super excited to share that with you, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.